This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fusaro.
In a way, despite a looming recession, we see that the consumers have a kind of backlog and a desire to spend on fashion.
That was senior partner Achim Berg talking about the resiliency of the fashion industry. He joins me to talk about it, but also points to signs of tough times ahead.
After, anxiety tends to get a bad rap, but listen to author Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, professor of psychology at Hunter College, to discover why anxious feelings deserve respect.
Achim, thanks so much for joining us today.
That's my pleasure, Roberta. Thank you.
Achim, the world has changed a lot since we last published our State of Fashion report. Which of the recent trends have had the greatest effect on fashion and the textile industry?
I think Ukraine and the invasion into Ukraine is one of those topics. I think that was not fully on the radar in November, December, and a lot of people didn't expect it. But that's not the only topic. I think we also didn't even know that Omicron would be the dominant variant in the first half of 2022. We did not expect that inflation would be a permanent challenge. We somehow expected, even like many governments, that this would be a temporary problem. We expected supply chain would normalize after 2 years of a pandemic, which also didn't come true. We also didn't expect COVID as such would be a big challenge in China again, because China looked like the big winner of the whole pandemic at the end of last year. So it's probably the challenge of writing a report that tries to somehow predict or frame the future, that things turn out slightly different. But I think overall, we still stayed to the forecasts and also to the topics that we identified to drive the industry in 2022.
From the panoply of issues that we've talked about, what challenges do suppliers face right now?
I think it's very different challenges. I think depending on where we look, which country we look at, some are quite challenged. So the supplier side, has a practical problem of delivering what is expected, but they are also facing issues of forecasting in a proper way, because we don't know exactly how the consumption patterns will develop. And the industry is always, a couple of months ahead of the consumer. So you need to make some bets. And it's in this environment, which is much more volatile than what we have seen in the last 20 years, it's very difficult to make the right bets.
Given the increased risk, or maybe it's sort of this perfect storm of risk all colliding together, how should companies respond? And what are some things that companies can do to hopefully end up on the right side of these big bets?
I think they should look for real partnerships with brands and closer exchange with the brands, because that would give them access to data and would make things, more predictable. On the other side, it's probably worthwhile to think on how to flex the system to the maximum, because I think demand patterns are not as stable as they used to be, and brands and retailers will be forced to react more flexibly to these challenges. And the suppliers are just by definition at the receiving end. So they will have to increase even more of that flexibility. Cost pressures will continue, so they will likely have to work also on the cost side and also on their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers in the whole system.
What were some of the more interesting data that came out from different geographies?
I think on a global level, we've seen a faster recovery than what we expected 18 months ago. I think we had expected that the whole industry would only get back to 2019 levels at the end of 2022. And on a global level, we achieved that already at the end of 2021. So you could argue that the fashion industry has shown more resilience and a faster ability to deal with challenges than what we had expected. And maybe we were too conservative in the eye of the storm. That might be another explanation. But the recovery was also quite different, by regions. Asia, with a very strong leadership of China, was the motor of the recovery right at the beginning. They had a very short dip and then they were doing quite well. Europe had the toughest, challenge to deal with. because they were lacking international travelers. And given the fragmentations of the markets, the recovery wasn't that fast and that strong. And North America was remarkable. I think we've seen a V-shape recovery, which we had seen also after some of the financial crisis before, but we didn't expect to see here in the pandemic. So far, I think it was pretty diverse. If we now look forward, again, it's difficult to make predictions, as we discussed right at the beginning of this podcast. China is currently, quite challenged with a zero COVID policy. It's reopening in important cities like Shanghai, but we don't know how long it will take to get a recovery here. Let's hope for the best, because that's going to be very important, in particular for the luxury part of the industry. Europe is currently doing better, also because we see, travel coming back, and North America, is still going strong. So I think it will heavily depend on how long the Ukraine crisis is going to continue, how long that will impact the cost of energy, and also how much stimulus the different governments will be able to provide after 2 years of continuous stimulus against the pandemic. So I think the jury is out. We will see, and we should prepare accordingly for some challenges to face.
During the height of the COVID-19 outbreak, we talked a lot about companies accelerating their use of technologies. Has this momentum continued?
I think technology plays a very important role. We also just published the new State of Fashion Technology Report, which tries to make an important point that we have to think technology really end to end. We used to focus more on the front end, everything that was more consumer focused through e-commerce, through loyalty systems. But we're realizing now that also the back end needs to be digitized for many reasons. We just spoke about the better ability to plan and to react, but also traceability from a sustainability point of view has become more important and will become even more important going forward. So digitizing the whole supply chain end to end is a big topic for many of our clients.
So thinking about the challenges now for brands, what sort of obstacles do these organizations face?
It all comes down to consumer demand. And as I said, I think we somehow had hoped that 2022 would mark the end of the pandemic, that a certain freedom would return that would allow people to celebrate, to entertain. And the fashion industry was very ready to dress the consumers exactly for that. And I think to a certain extent, we see that that is happening. Some of the categories that were hammered throughout the pandemic, like dresses, like high heels, even suits, have a strong return in the first 6 months or the first 5 months of this year. We also expect that people, will do a lot of traveling. I think Europe is clearly returning to the whole vacation industry. I think with the Americans do the same. Asia as well, with the exception of China, that will drive consumption. So in a way, despite a looming recession and inflation rates of 7 to 8%, we see that the consumers have a kind of backlog and a desire to spend on fashion. And that is despite Ukraine, which obviously has not been positive for consumption interests in Western Europe these days. The problem is that the energy bills will continue to increase. And I think we all don't know how long the conflict between Russia and the Western world will continue. Which will likely have a negative impact on the cost of energy and on the cost of living. And so we realistically will see a lot of consumers returning from vacation and from a great summer, realizing that everything has become much more expensive. And that could hit larger parts of the fashion industry, in particular, the discount, the value, and the mid-market segments. The jury is still out on how luxury will play out in this environment. We were all surprised how quickly luxury returned from the pandemic, mainly driven by China, but also by a very strong recovery and a fast recovery in the United States. The demand for luxury is super strong at this point in the year. That's why I'm more concerned about the Christmas business and in particular the outlook for 2023.
So thinking about that, Achim, what should brands do?
brands should prepare for a likely recession. I think if the recession is not happening, I think we're all going to be positively surprised. But given the current inflation levels all around the world, driven by energy cost increases and the fact that interest rates are increasing around the world, what we're discussing with a lot of the clients is, how to prepare for that. So on the one hand, having a robust plan for the demand side, and how can you flex your system similar to the suppliers to varying demands. I think the industry has been quite innovative in that respect over the last 2 years of the pandemic. So this will somehow have to continue. And I think on the other side, the industry will have to manage cost. Many of the leading and the big players have started tackling that and reviewing the investment budgets, reviewing the cost structures, and preparing for a challenging 2023. I think that is what we're going to see and what brands will have to focus on in the coming months.
Most companies in this industry have been challenged for several years now. So how do they respond to these disruptions, and how do they find ways to invest in new technologies?
2020 was the worst year from an economic profit point of view, I think, since we have figures about this industry. So probably going back to the Great Depression. 2021 was a recovery year for many. In that respect, a more difficult 2022 and even more difficult 2023, could have some devastating effects to the industry. Our report also shows that profitability is more and more polarized in the industry. In 2020, less than 1/3 of the companies were value generating, while 2/3 were value destroying. So a longer recession and a more challenging environment will definitely lead to a shakeout in the industry. We also see that there is a fraction of the companies that we call the super winners, that are the top 20 performers of the industry. But also you could broaden that, let's say, to the top 20% of the industry that are quite healthy, that have already started to invest into technology, into digitization. They've invested into sustainability. They've invested into talent, all the things that you would want to invest to. And they also have a more balanced, more global business. So they will likely get better through the months ahead. Without any question, I think companies will have to do this transformation, away from physical stores towards a more digital business model. And they will have to find ways to redirect budgets into those areas. And that will be more difficult for some than for others, which will likely lead to even more polarization in the industry.
Is sustainability one of those factors in thinking about how you're going to transform?
Sustainability is the big topic for the industry. It was the big topic before the pandemic hit. It continues to be the big topic. I always compare that we're going through different stages. I think it took us a couple of years to really create awareness for the topic and for the industry to accept that sustainability is a big topic, not only on CO2, but also on worker rights, on worker conditions, pollution in a much broader sense. And I think the industry finally has accepted the challenge. A lot of companies now have made commitments, most of them until 2030. COP26 was a big gathering and event in that respect. But we're now heading into a phase where the industry has to deliver against those promises. And that coincides now with a phase where we have likely limited budgets and more stress on the demand side. So without any doubt, it would have been much better in the end also for the planet, if we would have now a strong recovery after the pandemic. But that's unfortunately not what we are facing. On the other hand, the planet can also not afford that the industry is not making progress. So in that sense, companies will have to do all of that. They will have to deliver against the ambitions of digitization, but also against the demands of sustainability. The consumers have become more demanding in that respect. A lot of people have been at home throughout the pandemic. They had more time to think about their consumption patterns. We've seen a big change, in particular in Western Europe, but also in North America, how the consumers think about sustainability and what they demand from brands. And therefore, brands will have to do it all. It's not going to get any easier for brands and the whole industry in the next 18 to 24 months.
In the report, you talked about the use of digital product passports that contain information about how the products came into being and their impact on the environment. Do you think digital product passports are a good tool to help brands reach their sustainability commitments?
I think product passports in our annual report, but also traceability in our new tech report are, I think, the two big topics when it comes to sustainability. Digitization will be a key lever here, to provide the required transparency along the whole value chain, but also to provide that information to an ever more demanding consumer on the other side who wants to have that transparency. And let's not forget, there's even a regulator out there that will request that transparency. So the supply chains are very complex. There's different stages. It's happening in emerging markets. It's transported in most cases, at least around half of the world. So all of that requires the use of technology to provide the transparency and the reliability that you need to drive the business.
What are the lessons that companies can take from some of these top companies in our research?
Super winners have been outperforming the industry now for many, many years. That has led to the level of polarization that we have at the moment. We also expect that the top players will get stronger out of the next crisis we are facing. That's just naturally given the resources they've built, but also given the brands and the business systems they have built. So I think they are a constant inspiration for the rest of the industry. Not all of what they do, can be replicated because many players at the bottom of the performance have challenges to fund some of the things that the top performers are doing. I think it comes down to the old things. It's about big brands. In most price segments, you need to be a brand. You need to be active in different geographic regions to balance a bit your risk. It helps to also operate across different product categories. A higher share of digital and a more consistent use of data are clearly beneficial to the performance. And then lastly, it's the fashion industry. So if you put your chips on the right trend, and if you have the brand heat that you wish for, of course you're going to do better, and you can be like Phoenix from the ashes over the next couple of seasons. That's the beauty of the industry, and we see some strong brands now that were not that strong before the crisis. So it's not only a sliding scale for many, which it is unfortunately is, but there's always some renewal and innovation and hope. So we're going to see some surprises over the next 24 months without any question.
This has been great stuff. Thanks so much, Achim, for joining us today.
Thank you, Roberta, for having me.
And now, let's hear from Professor Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, featured in our Author Talk series, about her new book, Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad.
The core message of the book is we mental health professionals have unintentionally given people some damaging information when it comes to anxiety. First, it's that anxiety is always, every experience of it, a debilitating experience, it's dangerous, and it's even something we should think of as a disease. That means that the solution would be to prevent it and eradicate it and destroy it at all costs, like we do any disease. And the problem with that when it comes to anxiety is that that is literally a recipe for making anxiety worse. There's a paradox with anxiety. The more we avoid, the more it tends to spiral out of control. Anxiety can be very intense, very extreme even, but that doesn't mean that it's an anxiety disorder. We're looking at anxiety as a problem to solve, but anxiety is a feature of being human. So fear is the present certainty. We're absolutely certain that right now we're in danger. But anxiety is not that. Anxiety is apprehension about the uncertain future. By anchoring us into the future tense, this ability to actually think into the future not only protects us, but it actually also makes us more persistent, more innovative, more creative, and more socially connected. Because anxiety is an emotion that actually evolved to translate and to navigate the uncertain world. And of course, there's nothing so certain in the human condition as uncertainty. So when we're anxious, we actually have higher levels of dopamine in our brain. Dopamine helps us move towards positive outcomes. It also triggers our social bonding hormone, oxytocin, that hormone that increases when we're with someone we love. It's one of the ways that we biologically bond to each other. And when we're anxious, that hormone shoots up. Why? Because social connection, social bonding is one of the best ways that we manage our anxiety. In the book, I also talk about a 3-part framework for doing something with anxiety, for working with it. One is that we remember that anxiety is information and we need to listen to it. 2 is that sometimes it's not useful information. We can learn to tell the difference. And when we do know that it's not useful anxiety, we can use those great tools out there to let go and immerse ourselves in the present moment, get help through therapy, do those things that help us scale back from the future tense. And the third guideline is to really hitch that anxiety, that information we're getting about what we want in the future, what we care about. Hitch it to purpose, hitch it to something that really matters to you, that gives your life a sense of meaning.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahilly.
And I'm Roberta Fusaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And check out the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
And if you would, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.